뭐 시작하니까 많이 빠져나가서 이미 좀 빠지는 듯한 느낌인데, 앞전 세션에서 저희 키노트에서 지금까지 쭉 이렇게 많이 들어봤습니다. 물론 누군지 이제 하나 이제 기억나는 말이 있어서 이 빅데이터 관련해서 실제로 이제 하면서 수집, 저장, 그리고 분석을 하는 그런 과정에서 가장 마지막에 터치하는 건 이제 분석이다. 절대적으로 동의합니다. 가장 중요한 부분이고 사실 그걸 위해서 하는 것이 맞다라고 생각을 하기 때문에 하는데, 문제는 이제 그런 걸 하기 위한 이제 베이스 플랫폼 이런 부분들은 그걸 하기 위한 어떻게 보면 이제 기본이 되어가는 그런 구조가 아닌가 생각합니다. 따라서 그런 기본이 되는 부분에 있어서 어떤 확장을 가능한 플랫폼을 어떻게 구성을 할 것이냐, 이것이 중요하다라는, 어떤 형태로 가든, 이게 플랫폼 먼저 하고 과제를 도출하는 형태로 가든, 아니면 과제를 도출해서 플랫폼을 사용하는 형태로 가든, 그 둘 다 이 분석 플랫폼, 실제 있는 데이터 플랫폼이 중요하다는 얘기를 아까 다른 섹스 세션이었던 걸로 기억을 하는데요. 이렇게 하는 얘기를 들었습니다. 맞습니다. 클라우데라는 여기에 포커스를 맞추고 있습니다. 실제 이 데이터가 수집되고 저장되는 플랫폼, 그 플랫폼은 최근에 하둡이 거의 표준화로 표준적인 어떤 솔루션으로 또는 기술로 정착이 되어가고 있는 것 같습니다. 그런 하둡을 가장 잘하는 클라우데라에 대한 소개를 하고, 클라우데라로 실제로 제조기업에서 분석을 했던 그런 사례들을 설명을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 약간 말씀 잠깐 드리면 책자에 있는 내용이 프린트되어 있는 내용이 조금 부실한 사실입니다. 그래서 죄송하다고 말씀드리고요. 많이 업데이트해서 지금 바꿔놓습니다. 그래서 앞에 보시면서 들으시면 될 것 같습니다. 두 파트로 나누어서 진행을 하겠습니다. 앞에 부분은 일반적인 빅데이터 오버뷰와 실제 이제 클라우데라에 대한 간단하게 클라우데라 재팬 프레지던트이신 조 시뉴엘리 그래서 지금 기다리고 계신데 먼저 말씀을 좀 드리고요. 그리고 뒤에 실제 유즈 케이스와 클라우데라가 왜 해야 되는지 이런 부분들에 대한 부분은 제가 나머지 뒷부분을 말씀을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 조 시뉴엘리를 하겠습니다.
So I know it's probably been a long day for everybody and everybody's a little bit tired. So I promise, and I apologize if this is going to be in English, but I do promise to speak slowly. But before I get started, I was asked to present about use cases in the big data space. And before I get into it, I want to kind of get a sampling from the audience, or from you, as to who is actually deployed Hadoop in their environment. Not Cloudera, any distribution. And either a POC, by a raise of hands, has any organization within this room actually testing Hadoop in some kind of a use case situation? I see 2 or 3. How about in a production environment? Not yet. So I think when you see the presentation, I think you'll get an understanding that this kind of validates what we're talking about. I think we're all familiar with what Hadoop is. It's open source, it's Apache driven, it's built by communities. Companies like Cloudera, Workworks, and others build distributions around it. But what's really important is to understand why companies were even beginning to look at it. The few that have deployed POCs or brought it into your labs to start testing it are probably already starting to realize some of the real values and benefits the technology itself brings to your organizations. If you take a look at it, one of the main reasons is around flexibility and scalability. But even beyond that, it's the amount of savings and the ROI that companies realize from investing into a Hadoop infrastructure. You ask yourself, well, what is that going to save me? And we're going to talk a little bit about that and get also a little more market perspective to understand where the Korean market is in relation to other markets. And I can kind of share with you what else is going on in other regions around use cases and deployments of Hadoop. So I think to first realize, you need to understand the size of the market we're talking about on a global basis. We're talking just Hadoop alone, which has only been around for about 5 years, is already about a $14 billion market for Hadoop itself. But when you look at the other pieces and parts that get driven into that market, the services, the hardware, all of that pieces together, it's an enormous market share that is growing. What differentiates it? If we look at where that growth is taking place, it's around structured data is where it starts. But the value of Hadoop in your environment really is the unstructured data. And being able to analyze that data, predictive analytics, leveraging the corporate data in addition to Twitter, Facebook, all the social media data. If you look at the amount of data that's being created on a daily basis, I think it was mentioned something like the last 2 years, more data has been created in the last 2 years than has been created since the beginning of time. And this is doubling every 2 years. There is no way, absolutely no way, that companies can afford to retain that data in a structured database. The cost is astronomical. So there's a need to find different ways of doing this. This is where really the vision of Cloudera, and I apologize, I'm not going to make this a sales pitch, I promise. But I think you need to understand the visions that the founders of Cloudera had back in 2008. They saw this trend before it even happened from a few Google and Yahoo white papers that were written. So Mike Olson and Ammer and Doug Hammerbacher started the company, who are awesome people, extremely smart in this industry, but had the vision and brought Doug Cutting into the corporation. And Doug Cutting was really the founder and developer of Hadoop. His child's toy is the elephant that you see all over the place. So it's kind of interesting to spend some time with him. But as you can see the progression over time of what things happen. If you look at where Hadoop started, it was based around batch processing, map-reduced jobs. That's great. But time has changed and progressed to the point now where companies need the ability to do real-time analytics. They need to do real-time query. But they need to do it against all that structured and unstructured data. So when you look at 2013, was really the transition from batch processing more into real-time analytics, which really is the pivotal point, bringing it more into the enterprise space. So when you look at products like Impala and Navigator and Search, and the ability to track data, the life cycle of the data from beginning to end, and the ability to manage that with security, now allows enterprises with privacy laws and things like that to bring that now into an Hadoop instance, reducing the cost from their expensive BI systems. We'll talk more about that. But in 2014, with that enterprise capability, is where we introduced the concept of the Enterprise Data Hub, and I'll talk a little more about that later. One of the biggest things that's happened for Cloudera, which is great not only for Cloudera but for Hadoop itself, was when Intel got invested into Cloudera of almost $1 billion. Because they realized that Cloudera, as it was the first distribution, is a leader in the distribution and really the thought leadership going forward in the creation of the tools that are being used by the enterprises. That investment not only cements our position in the market to continue that development and enhancement, but more importantly, how that then relates to servers and storage and everything else that's going on. Because as we start to integrate the chips and Intel, and we start to look at the applications themselves, we start to look at performance. We start to look at how do we make this even the next step better. And that relationship's going to make it happen. So that's pretty much the history of it. If you look at Cloudera as a company, in just the last 5 years, 5.5 years, we've grown to a company of over 700. Actually, right now it's about 750 employees. But what differentiates us from the rest of the world is really our both proactive and reactive support. I'm not going to go into it. It's not what this is all about. But I just want to give you an idea of what we do. The other part that is very important, because it is such a new market, is this piece right here, Cloudera University. We've actually provide, oh, we're missing one slide. Somebody took it out. But we actually produce about 84% of the educational content that is delivered. And we deliver it in native language in most countries through Cloudera. In Korea, we leverage a company here called IOB Tech, who has helped to sponsor this piece of it, that brings that to Korea in native language. That's not just about Cloudera training, of Impala and HBase and things like that. It's all the administrative training that's required to run Duke. And the good part is it's done in Korea. So you're getting the most out of it. But the content is the same. When you take a look across the industries that are starting to deploy this, I think you can see from just a sampling of it, there's over 1,000 partners that are driving this business. But when you look at the companies that are involved with, let's call it a startup technology, it's pretty amazing. Some of the major banks in the world, some of the largest manufacturing, both car, chips, retail chains, the Walmarts, MasterCard, Visa, some of the biggest companies in the world are leveraging this technology to further and better position them in the market and be more competitive. This gives you a little sampling of it. So you ask yourself, what's the real difference? It's the old way of doing things and the new way. We all know that in IT, it's changing every single day, so tomorrow's going to be even a newer way. But where we are today is the old way was really bringing data actually to the compute. So we would store our silos of data throughout the data center. As we needed to analyze it or process it, we would move it to the system we want to work with them. In the new way of doing it, it's a little more structured. Because now what we're taking is all the structured and unstructured data and moving it into a central repository, a Hadoop file system, and allowing all areas of the business to analyze it. But marketing, for example, is not just looking at marketing data. Manufacturing is not just looking at manufacturing data. Suddenly, organizations have the ability to have a 360-degree view of the entire business. It's powerful. It's powerful when you start to analyze trends and things like that. So when I go deeper into this a little bit, you're going to get a more feel for some of the value that that brings. Just a picture, the old boxes versus the clusters and the arrays, bringing the compute to the data. So some of the challenges, I'm going to put all these up right away, is in the old way, we're missing data. It's difficult because it doesn't exist. Or we have it, but we don't have the ability to access it. When we look at time to data, how long does it take to move terabytes of information from one place to another? By the time I get it there, it's useless. So I need access to it real time. Cost of analytics, we talked about that, and complex architectures. Very difficult to manage, very difficult to govern, and security becomes a nightmare when you try to leverage that across different platforms. But in the new way, it actually takes a lot away from that. Because now, when we move things off into archives, we don't just lose the data. We now have the ability to analyze that data. So that becomes part of those use cases that we're going to move into later. When we look at the transformation and the ETL of data from one platform to another, we start to look at patterns and things like that, because we don't have to necessarily wait for the data to be in the file system to do it. We can do stream processing. So think about credit card transactions. As financial transactions are coming through, I'm analyzing that data as it's actually hitting the Hadoop file system, and then doing further analysis later. The best way to look at it, and a lot of people say, well, wait a second, if I can do all these really neat things with my Hadoop file system, why do I need Oracle? Why do I need Teradata? The fact is, you do. Hadoop doesn't replace it, okay? It sits beside it and complements it, just as those BI systems complement Hadoop. And the great part is that you have the ability to access both at the same time, but at a fraction of the price. So when you look at, I call it EDH, our Enterprise Data Hub, it's like an iPhone. I take a picture, I store the data, I push it to Facebook, I do all the things that are simple. It's good enough. It takes a great picture. It's not as good as my SLR camera, but it's good enough. There are certain applications, though, that are too complex or performance-oriented that need to run in the SLR platform. But do I need all of it there? And the answer is no. And companies are quickly finding this out and changing the way they're doing things. This gives you an idea of some of our partners. What's amazing, here's a company that is 5-6 years old. There's over 1,000 partners and alliances associated with Cloudera. Some of the largest, you see the names. You know, I'm sure in this room you probably have at least 4 or 5 of those in your data center doing something today. And we partner with each and every one of them. We talked a little bit, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but again, when you start looking at the data center, some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing when you start deploying servers and storage is around density, power consumption, cooling, all the things associated to that expense. The relationship between Intel and Cloudera starts to maximize some of that. We start to move and enhance the performance of Cloudera or Hadoop on the chipsets. Rather than doing software, we move into the chips. Cloudera is the only one that can do this with the Intel architecture. So we have the strong relationships with the server manufacturers, the HPs, the Dells, and so on. The other piece that we talked about is around education. And the reason this is so important, and I promise you I will get to the use cases, but the reason education is so important is it's a very immature market. Okay? If I look out in the field, it's very easy to go hire a DBA. They're all over. I can hire Unix administrators a dime a dozen. But when you go out to look at Hadoop administrators, or data scientists, or analysts, far and few between. So this is where education and training comes in, because you can't even begin to discuss a use case until you understand what the data is. And in order to do that, it's a different type of training than just Oracle DBA and performance tuning. You need to understand the relationships of data, statistical analysis of the data. It's much more complex. So companies that think they will deploy a Hadoop or a Cloudera or some other distribution quickly realize that they need to sit back and think about it. And this is why I'm kind of talking about it, because it's not just a use case. And I'm going to kind of give you some insight as to what to look for and how to determine where's the best place to start to be successful and then to grow from there. Education is definitely the start. That's the slide I was looking for. I knew it was in there. We created about 84% of the content in both all universities, in the field, around Hadoop, and Cloudera. So here's where we're starting to get closer to the use cases. If we look at the adoption curve within the markets, let's call it APJ, we're probably right down around here. When we look at the adoption of this technology in America or EMEA, we're probably moving right up into about this section. And the distance between from there to there is about a year and a half to 2 years. Maybe even a little bit more. And it really depends on the companies that are looking at it and deploying it. In each industry, there's always the early adopters. There's always the ones that are out there ahead of the pack trying to deploy it. So banks are saying, they did say, well, wait a second. I don't need Hadoop. I've been analyzing credit card transactions for the last 15, 20 years. I'm finding my fraud. I'm finding all the issues that deal with that. I don't need it. The reality is, they do. And a perfect case study is that if I look at the data they were storing in their BI systems and analyzing, the maximum amount of data they could actually store was only about 3 years. Our friends, the guys that are stealing from people, they're smart. They look at ways to get around systems. When one of the, I can't mention names, but when one of the major banks in their credit card department implemented a Hadoop solution, they then began to capture not only the 3 years, they brought back data from prior years, and then they turned around and continued to store new transactional data. And what they found was there was a pattern, a predicted pattern, that saved the bank almost $30 billion a year in transaction fraud that within a 3-year span was not noticed. But when you brought it out over a 10-year span or an 8-year span, suddenly different patterns presented themselves. This is what big data and analytics is all about. So, before I go any further, am I talking too fast? Okay, I just want to make sure. And again, I do apologize. You should see me do this in Japan. It's even more difficult. But anyways, talking about some other use cases that we see. Probably one of the more interesting ones is around healthcare. Jeff Hammerbecker, one of our chief data scientists, one of the original founders, works with some of the largest hospitals in New York. It's amazing the technology that they're bringing to the medical field and how they're leveraging it to better our health and the way we live. Think about all those little Nike fuel bands that we all walk around with and we track the number of steps. And then they add our heartbeats to it and they start to track all that. And they start to bring all that data into different repositories and they start to analyze it. And suddenly, this is a very simple version of it, but somebody then has a heart attack. There are certain things that happen with a person prior to having a heart attack that is a predictive analysis. So if I can start capturing data against the patient, and I can baseline that data, and then over time can analyze on a regular basis, whether it be a watch or some kind of device, suddenly now I can predict whether something's going to happen. It may then be technology for every single person, but if I've had a heart attack in the past, and I'm measuring my body functions against the masses, it's probably a good chance that they're going to uncover a problem before it happens. Even Cloudera itself, we have probably one of the largest instances of Hadoop in the world. And what do we use it for? Predictive analysis on clusters. So we have clusters deployed all around the world. We collect logs from our what we call Cloudera Manager, and we collect that from all our customers. We don't collect their data, we collect the performance of the actual systems. From that, when we see a problem, we can then look back at what were the conditions that happened prior to that. Think about deploying in your own data center. If you started capturing data from all your own systems, your storage, your memory, your servers, you could probably start to predict failures before they even occur. We do that with our customer, and that's what Cloudera refers to as proactive support. It's a great use case. Another one that's probably more relevant in Korea, and I'm not going to go into a lot of this because you're going to hear additional case studies in a little bit, but around oil and gas and retail. I mean, retail especially. Think about companies, McDonald's. So in the north side of Korea, people like chicken McNuggets. On the south side, they like hamburgers. If I have that information and I can start to analyze that against the masses, I can start maximizing my profits in individual stores and seeing different patterns of the way people eat and buy food. A really cool example of this, and I'm not going to give you the country, but you'll probably guess, preparing for the Olympics, is starting to look at foreigners coming into the country, providing access points to allow them to be able to track the patterns of people. Why? If I wake up every single morning, well, first of all, I get off my plane and I say, no Wi-Fi. I can't afford to use Wi-Fi, but if I give them free Wi-Fi and I collect all their data, now I can track their movement with an app. Every morning, the person wakes up, he goes to Starbucks, he has a cup of coffee, 8 o'clock in the morning, the whole time he's there, I can send push notifications to him to say, hey, there's a Starbucks not too far from your place. Or there's a McDonald's not too far from where you are, and we see that you like that. Or whatever those people are doing. So these are the ways that you need to start thinking about use cases and how to deploy it. Don't get hung up on the technology. There's not enough knowledge in our data centers today or with the people that are currently out there to get hung up on different technologies, and every day they're coming out. Whether it be in Palo, whether it be in Search, and Hive, and Fume, you pick it. There are so many that if you do that, you'll just stop. You'll try so hard to understand the technology that you'll forget why you're even looking at the technology. So step back. Probably the best way to really look at this is right here. Take an operational use case that you're currently doing in your BI system, whether it be Oracle or Teradata or whoever it is. Take a look at it. Understand what it's doing, because that is your use case. And say to yourself, if I move that into Hadoop, or if I move that into Cloudera or another distribution, what am I saving? What is the value to me? The value is that your IT department doesn't necessarily have to give that information back to your end user. Your end users now have the access to that data and more. That's where all the agility and flexibility within the organizations is really paying off. The other big thing is in most IT technologies, and you see the gray hair, I've been around for a while, it's always been sold to IT. Okay? This technology is a little bit different. This is typically sold up into the business units of the organization. The people looking at how do we maximize profits? How do we maximize customer satisfaction? How do we create new business opportunities from our data? How do we monetize that data? This is why people and companies are so intent on leveraging it, because you can't do this in any other environment. So, the leading indicators, if you start to ask yourself, I need to analyze more data. I don't have the resources. I don't have the people. I can't deliver to my customers in a timely fashion. Amr Al-Madala, one of the founders, worked for Yahoo, and he was responsible for all their data warehousing and running all the reports. One of the reasons why Hadoop came to reality was that he was pressured that he had to run a report overnight. So he had like 9 hours, 10 hours to run the report. The problem was he was pushing 14, 20, 24 hours to get it done. So he had two solutions. Either get fired, not give him the data, or find a way to do it. That was a way to do it. Because you can analyze that data so quickly. Minutes, seconds, versus days and hours. So it's a huge benefit. I know I kind of covered a lot. I didn't give you specific